I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are dirt poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me though, I'd absolutely have to move somewhere else. It's one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you get stuck there, without anything else going for you at least. Excluding a handful of doctors, lawyers, and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in area is Walmart, fast food, and maybe if you're lucky working at a grocery store. To the east of my town, there's this massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy going on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's a 10-mile drive out from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for many miles. In the past, there had been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads as well. It was so bad that the gravel parking lots glittered with bits of broken glass from what I'm assuming were car windows. Sometimes there were really shifty people hanging around as well, or just driving around on the forest roads. These were some really rough roads too. You'd see these beat-up $500 cars, just barreling along roads meant for a 4x4. Some of these people you see in those cars, you can just tell at a glance that they're shady. All that being said, it was still my favorite place to camp. You just had to be a bit careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. Probably not legal. We decided to turn this paintball expedition into a full-on camping trip so we could play the next morning as well. After a pretty uneventful first day of shooting paintballs at one another, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up every spot in the area. This was really the only spot we were familiar with, and it was getting quite late at this point. We had to keep on looking for another. We drove about an hour further into the woods. By this time, it was really getting dark, and we were getting really worried about finding a new spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us could get any service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that was in very rough shape. In fact, it looked like the Forest Service Rangers had used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. It looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down at this point. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to just go over the mound. There was this old gravel road on the other side, pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few more miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood picnic table nailed to a tree. This was a pretty odd set piece. That being said, it was pretty much dark at this point. We couldn't keep driving around all night in the woods looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and went to set up the tent. As we were doing so, I started to notice there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I could see a green bottle laying on the ground. Took a look at the label only to see it was a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time. I thought someone must have been dumping their garbage out illegally here. None of us really thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area more than an hour away from the nearest home. We set up camp, grabbed some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was around 11 p.m. As we were eating, though, we noticed a faint glow coming from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles just didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving either. It was kind of like that glow you'd see when looking out over a bright city. We couldn't identify the source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, it couldn't be other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go and investigate this odd occurrence. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have done so. However, we'd all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, so two of us, Jacob and I, decided we'd go take a quick look. My other friend Isaac decided to stay behind and pop some popcorn or something. We started walking toward the light source, and the situation got even stranger. As we looked on, all the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. At first, we thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek or something. But that didn't make any sense. Why would a beaver go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle? Jacob and I started talking about this ghost beaver in a pretty loud voice, probably due to our sheer drunkenness. As we were about to crest the top of the hill, Jacob tripped on a rock and shouted out, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other. Maybe we really didn't need to see what that light was after all. We walked back in silence, looking back over our shoulders every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlights as well, and just use the moonlight to get back. When we arrived within a couple 100 feet of the campsite, I could see Isaac walking in circles around it. He was wearing a hooded coat I hadn't seen him wearing before, and for some reason, he was now carrying his paintball gun in his hand. That seemed a bit odd. The fire had started to die down now, so we couldn't see anything else very well. At this point, we'd been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept on walking around the site, peering into the tent occasionally. Only, when we had almost arrived back, we saw Isaac walk up the road we'd come in on. We figured he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us or something. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for him to return. All of a sudden, we saw him lurch out of the tent instead. He stumbled a few feet forward and vomited. After we had left, he'd had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. Well, we asked him why he'd kept on wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he got a strange look on his face. "They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it or something?" We went and checked, entered the door code, and saw all our paintball equipment just as we'd left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden. I got a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I was watching a movie on my phone and then I fell asleep, I guess." "That was you walking around with your paintball gun just then, right?" Isaac said he'd been in the tent ever since we'd left, and he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite searching, and it was not Isaac. At this point, all of us were way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We didn't even bother packing up the tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jumped in the F-150, and I started to drive out. When we got to the dirt hump, I could see something gray blocking our path back. The metal barrier that had been laying in the woods earlier was back on its stand, right on top of the hump earlier. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wanted to leave the car to move it out of the way. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. I guess it popped off with the force, and we drove over it slowly. We were terrified it would pop one of the tires as we drove over, but thankfully it didn't. As we continued to drive down the road, I could see a vehicle following us with its lights off, probably 1,000 feet behind us. I almost wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't kept catching glimpses of it as the moonlight reflected off. I started to drive as fast as I could on that forest road, and the other vehicle kept pace behind. It never got any closer though. It just stayed 1 or 2 turns behind us. We could only see it when the road straightened out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we made it back to the main paved road. I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI somehow. Camping can be very fun, but rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place like it's supposed to be. I would never go down that road again at night, though. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a USAF Security Forces airman, a military policeman basically. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go explore some back roads to get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, but many more totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I had spent many a day starting off on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, and driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over those mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on before and began our drive outward. After driving for around an hour or so, we hadn't seen nor heard any sign of any other people in these woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by aspen groves. This meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, no insect noise, no squirrels, certainly no other people either. On the other side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, we could see a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table you'd see in a park. Remarking on the strangeness of this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being very apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the area was very unsettling. It was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as the aspens grew extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were at my chest level. I would have had to climb up to even sit down. As I was looking over this weird thing, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was now glancing out into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at. Then, though, I noticed a splash of color, completely out of place in the thick trees. It was almost hidden away, a small one-man tent set back in the trees about 50 feet from this strange table. I had a feeling of dread and felt certain that someone must be in there. If we could see that tent, they could see us as well. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone this remote and trying to hide would at the very least be a strange person. As we observed the tent though, we didn't see any movement nor hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I still did so anyway. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about just driving away and leaving this strange area. We began to fear the worst though. What if there was a body in this tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped or something and they were hiding out here? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards this tent. I was totally keyed up, with my senses on full alert. As I reached the campsite hidden in the trees, several things struck me as odd immediately. I could see backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was it was full of backpacks and women's clothing as well. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had just seen. As I turned though, I could hear Nick now yelling, "Come on man, let's go, let's get the fuck out of here!" I didn't know why he was yelling now, but I ran back to the truck nonetheless. When I broke out of the trees, I could see a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from exiting. I leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, a third person laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us in from the road. Nick barely managed to swerve around them and accelerated the way we had come from. I looked back, only to see the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road and follow. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing that car again. I don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police immediately, and they promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. I received a call the next day from a trooper though, stating the campsite, the backpacks, and the woman's clothing were all gone. He could tell people had been in the area though. The strange table was still by the grove. I've not returned to that area since, and I don't intend to ever again. When I was 18, I spent quite a lot of time in the Cohutta Wilderness. My favorite spot was this set of waterfalls several miles from the nearest parking area. Most visitors just parked in the RV area and swam in the creek right along the gravel road. In the 2 years I'd hiked all those trails, I had never seen anyone further than a half-mile in. Anyway, one Saturday, I took my girlfriend to see these beautiful waterfalls, since she had never had the opportunity to see one in person before. We set off along the trail. When not 15 minutes into our walk, she grabbed my arm and got real quiet. She told me she felt like she was being watched and had those heebie-jeebies. I assured her that everything was safe. The only thing I'd ever had to worry about in this part of the woods were the occasional bear or maybe a copperhead. We continued on, but instead of leaving, the feeling of being watched just kept on getting worse and worse for her. I figured at first she just wasn't used to the wilderness yet and was having a bit of trouble adjusting. A couple of hours later, we finally reached the end of the trail and had a picnic at the bottom of the falls. After we finished eating, she tried to check her cell phone for messages, only to panic when she realized we had no service. I calmly explained to her that there was no cell reception anywhere around for miles. We were finally alone and could just enjoy some peace and solitude. This, of course, made her panic even worse. We decided to start heading back almost immediately. She was clearly scared, and I couldn't help but smile, thinking it was very silly. On the way back, I explained to her how many times I'd been out there all alone, and I'd never had any problems. Still though, she just couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. We were about a mile from the falls now, on the only trail around, when suddenly, we heard someone call out to us from behind. I nearly jumped out of my skin and turned to see a man walking towards us. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and a heavy beard with his hat tipped low over his face. My girlfriend took a small step behind me. Hello, sir. What can I do for you?" I asked, trying to sound friendly.
"Oh, you guys left your cell phone back by the falls," he said,
a slight grin on his beard as he looked at my girlfriend. "Oh, thanks for the assist, buddy," I said, extending my hand. He shook his head. He told me he hadn't brought it with him. It was still sitting up there. Maybe we should follow him instead and come get it ourselves. We politely declined, of course, and made our way back down the trail as quickly as possible, him following us the entire way and trying to stay out of sight. I noticed that he'd followed us all the way back to our car even. She showed me her cell phone was still in her pocket when I opened her door. Ever since that, I didn't go back on that particular trail again. In May of 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and very upsetting. When a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping and fishing trip, I jumped at the chance to leave. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a particular creek named Grindstone Creek. It was close to a wetland area, and the fishing was supposed to be really good. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field, guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. It was a pretty good and fun night, actually. We turned in just after midnight and shared the tent together. My buddy fell asleep before me. I stayed up playing on my phone until around 1:30 or so. I must have drifted off at some point because next thing I remember, I was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy still, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant and sounded like a weird coyote or something. I laid there for a moment listening, then started playing on my phone again. That noise was annoying as hell. I tried my very best to ignore it, but it sounded like it was getting a lot closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet away. At this point, I became very unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a small dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food and brought its buddies? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I was very prone to worrying about these types of thoughts. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, only to see that the noise had woken him up too. We discussed about what we would do to this coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing really. Finally, he decided he would just shine the flashlight at it and holler quite a lot, hopefully scaring the animal off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him point the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. He peeked his head out. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards in shock. He had this dumbfounded look on his face and started to babble. "It's not a coyote, it's a dude out there. Some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily, so that was the type of thing he would do. But I had never seen someone look so genuinely scared. I never want to see that expression on someone's face again either. I knew he couldn't be pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling noises were still going on. In retrospect, it didn't really sound like a coyote. I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. My friend kept on telling me to take a look and make sure he was not going crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. I slowly peeked out of the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. A man, standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying back and forth, wearing a baseball cap. What made it really awful though, what was really creepy, was that he was only wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. I pulled my head back inside the tent, and my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy. My buddy started yelling first. "Hey dude, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent. We heard the footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside. We didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. "Seriously, fuck off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't fuck off, we're gonna call the Rangers." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off, moving towards the road, it sounded like. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how we'd handled the situation. Definitely not handling it the best on either of our parts. I think we're both ashamed because of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We haven't really ever talked about it since that day. I always wonder just what the hell that guy was doing out there, and what the hell was wrong with him either. I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls instead of two guys. I'm not saying he was a serial killer or something, but it seemed like he was testing us when we were in the tent. I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad.
I was one of the luckiest kids in our high school that had the privilege of driving into school about halfway through the day. Our school day was divided into 9 periods, and because I had enough credits to graduate aside from a select few, I was always allowed to show up right before the 4th period. That was when my first class was. The day started out like any other. I woke up and got myself ready for school. I remember the steam pouring off my coffee cup was intense that morning, but the heat was a refreshing contrast to the cold bite of the winter air. I loaded everything up into my car and drove the 8 miles to get to my school. My phone kept going off, which was irritating because the notification sound kept interrupting the music playing from it. I ignored the messages and figured whatever it was could wait until I got to school. When I arrived, I noticed that something was off. The parking lot was full of cars, but no students. I mean, I knew it was a bit late in the day, but there were actually quite a few of us who would show up around the same time. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I just brushed it off and just assumed they had already made their way into the semi-warm school. So I decided to do the same. I grabbed my phone and my bag, locked my car, and walked into the lobby, only to be met with silence. Something wasn't right. I looked at my watch, and it was 10:36 a.m. The hall should have been full of students who had been rushing to get to their next class. I didn't understand why at the time, but for some reason, the emptiness of the halls made everything feel tense. I began to walk a bit down the hall. That was when I noticed that all the classroom doors were shut, which was odd because most of the teachers liked to keep them open, as long as it wasn't too loud in the halls. Then all of a sudden, I remember the spam of messages I had gotten on my way into school. I almost threw my phone with how hard I ripped it from my pocket. I put in my passcode and then came face to face with one of my biggest fears. My phone had 4 text messages from my friend who had been trying desperately to get in contact with me. The messages read in order: "Yo, something weird is going on. Hey man, are you on your way yet? Yo, don't come in." And the last message read: "Stranger in the halls. Teacher says he has a knife. Don't come in." My heart sank, and for a second, I couldn't catch my breath. Immediately, I began walking from one classroom to another, trying the handles on every door, but there was nothing. That's when I heard the sound of sneakers scuffing across the tile floor at the other side of the hall. I knew I had to hide, but I didn't have many options, so I threw myself behind a row of lockers and tried to tuck my legs in. The footsteps grew closer. They had definitely made it into the section of the hallway when all of a sudden they stopped. I'll never forget the sound of his gravelly voice when he said, "Is that a leg I see?" I panicked. I heard the footsteps start up again, growing closer with each passing second. I had to make a decision. I ran across the lobby of the school and threw open the doors to the auditorium. I didn't hesitate. Fight or flight kicked in, and it's like my legs knew where to bring me before I could even think of it. I ran all the way to the stage and made my way behind the curtain. As I tucked myself behind the curtain, I heard the door to the auditorium slam closed. He was inside the room with me. The footsteps drew closer and closer, with each step growing louder. I began to look around for another place to run, when all of a sudden I heard the sound of a door opening behind me. When I looked, I was relieved to see one of the custodians. He was ushering me over to him, but kept one hand to his mouth as to tell me, "Stay quiet." As quickly and quietly as I could, I ran over to him and the two of us hid, locked in a supply closet for what felt like forever, as we heard the man pacing back and forth across the stage. After what felt like an eternity, but turned out to be only a couple of minutes, police arrived on the scene and the man fled. I had to give my statement to one of the officers, who told me I was lucky to have found the supply closet. Apparently, the man was carrying around a large hunting knife, and the other officer said he doesn't know what would have happened if I had been caught by him. Do you know how some high schools are known for their football or their wrestling team? Well, mine was known for our swimming and diving team, of which I was the captain for my last 2 years. And every year like clockwork, we would wrap up the season with a fun little pool party at the school for just the teammates and their family members. Well, I had my own tradition, which was to do 100 laps in the pool before it closed each season. And every year, it went fine. I had spent most of my life swimming, so I was never worried that anything would go wrong in my school's pool. When I would attempt my yearly ritual during my senior year, however, I would learn that you never know when something is going to go wrong. So all my teammates had left, and I was going through my laps as usual, and I had made it up to lap 73. Everything was going great, when all of a sudden, as I pushed off the wall in the shallow side of the pool, I felt something smack me in the back of the head. I don't know exactly how long I was out for, but when I came to, I immediately began to panic. Someone had accidentally closed the mechanical pool cover while I was inside. There were about 8 inches between the water and the dark blue roof that was now hovering over me. The smell of chlorine had filled the air and breathing became hard. I slowly made my way from one side of the pool to the other in hopes that there would be a small crack or opening that I could pull myself out of, but there was nothing. It was at this point that I began to grow lightheaded, and any strength I had left was being used by my legs to keep me afloat. My eyes grew heavy, and the world around me was getting darker. The cool water almost felt nice as I slowly began to sink. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. One of the coaches must have seen me moving under the pool cover because she was able to get it open and pull me out before I had swallowed too much water. If she wasn't there that night, there is no way I would have made it out of that pool alive. I was sitting in my earth science class near the window, as I often did. I made it a point to get to all my classes early so I could get the best seat. That day, I would regret choosing to sit near the window though, as it would turn into a day that I would never forget. So I was just sitting there, doing my best to pay attention to the lesson, when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. I could have sworn that I saw something move near the tree line. When I looked again, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, so I just decided to go back to paying attention to the teacher. That was when I noticed it again. Only this time when I looked, I noticed that there was a grown man standing beside one of the pine trees that lined the field. He was just standing there in what appeared to be a dirt-covered clothing and a ski cap. I thought it was odd, so I raised my hand in hopes to bring it to the attention of my teacher. However, when we all turned to look out the window, there was no one there. The teacher told me to stop fooling around and just pay attention, so I did. I tried my best to wipe the entire experience from my mind. I finished out the school day and made my way home. I only lived about a half a mile from my high school, so I would usually walk home. I could have taken the bus if I wanted to, but I enjoyed the walk. I didn't enjoy it that day though. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling like I was being watched. I tried my best not to be suspicious about it, but I slowly began increasing my walking speed. After what seemed like 10 times the usual distance, I finally made it home. And as soon as my house was in sight, I sprinted across my lawn and into my front door. I locked the door behind me and began to fill my mom in on my experience. She was quick to write it off as just me being on edge and assured me that everything was fine. I tried my best to agree with her on that, but something in my gut wouldn't let me settle down. After a very long day, it had finally hit 10 p.m. and it was time for me to go to sleep. But sleep never came. Instead, I kept tossing and turning in my bed. I could swear that I still felt someone watching me. After a couple of hours passed, I had begun to drift off when out of the nowhere I heard what sounded like scratching on the glass. I immediately turned to my window, where I could swear I saw the edge of someone's shirt as they tucked themselves behind the wall. Before I could react, I heard my mom yelling for me. I leapt across my room and ran through my door, slamming closed as I passed. When I made it to my mom's room, she told me to close the door. After I did, with no questions asked, she said someone is outside of the house. My heart began to race. The police are on the way, just stay in here. My mom pulled out her phone and opened up the security camera. The man wasn't there anymore, but at a closer look, we could now see that my bedroom window has been opened. It wasn't long before the police arrived, though it felt like hours. By the time they got to my house, whoever it was had left. As I began to tell the police officers about the man I had seen at school earlier that day, he said that he and his partner would search the woods to see what they find. When they returned, I was horrified to find out they had found what they said was a homeless person's campsite. They said they also found a small journal with drawings of my classroom window, and at the last page, he had written, "It's time." To this day, no one knows who that man was or where he went. All I know is our dog has been sleeping in my room ever since.